Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Department of Teaching and Learning's lecture series, Teaching and Learning Matters. It gives me a thrill, in fact, to welcome Shondel and Raul to talk about their recently published book, and timing is everything, as we know, The Power of Narrative, Climate Skepticism and the Deconstruction of Science. It strikes me that I was so excited when Shondel and Raul told me they were collaborating on this book, because I do see this issue of communication to be truly something that we need to address, not just in the Department of Teaching and Learning, but more broadly. And so I'm really excited to hear what Raul and Shondel have to say. I'm really looking forward to this. And obviously, the number of people that have joined us, and I want to welcome you all as well, also speak to the timeliness of their presentation and the timeliness of their book. So without further ado, because you've come here to hear from them, I'd like to welcome Raul, Lejano and Shondel Nero. Thank you very much, and we'll hand it over to you both.
Thank you, Kath. Thanks for that warm welcome, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We are thrilled to have you join us to talk about Raul and my new co-authored book, The Power of Narrative, Climate Skepticism and the Deconstruction of Science. I just want to give a shout out to all my friends and relatives and colleagues who are on the call today. It's really an honor to have you join the conversation. So we'll get right to it. The title of our presentation is very much the title of our book. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of, how we're going to proceed today. And then Raul and I will go back and forth. And so sometimes he'll share the screen and sometimes I'll share the screen. So first, Raul is going to talk a little bit about what prompted the idea for the book. And then I'll talk about how we got together to collaborate. We are from two different disciplines. Raul is an environmental scientist and I'm an applied linguist. So it's an interesting interdisciplinary collaboration. Raul will talk a little bit about narrative research, and I will talk a little bit about the evolution of this, what we're calling this climate skeptic narrative, particularly looking at some of the texts that we analyzed. Raul will talk a little bit about what we call the genetic meta-narrative, and then where do we go from here? So I wanted to just show a picture of the book. Some of you may already have had it, but that's what it looks like. And Raul's, our cartoonist, has offered an interesting way of thinking about climate through a reference to the biblical story of Noah and the Ark. And you see there the language, I keep telling him that climate is always changing. So keep in mind that we're going to be looking at the skeptical point of view about narrative, and particularly climate change, and how we work through these ideological differences. So this is where we are. On the top row across here, this is just a little snapshot of the language of climate skepticism. And in fact, the first three at the top here are actually samples from some of the data that we looked at. And you see the first scientist economist challenge alarmism at climate conference. And I want you to keep in mind that word alarmism, because we will be coming back to it. Secondly, you see this climate change, the hoax that costs us $4 billion a day. Keep in mind that word hoax. And then we see over here 7 pieces of fake news about the latest US climate report. And another favorite phrase, fake news. At the bottom, we wanted you to see that this skepticism, which otherwise might be called denial, is still with us. This is a cover of a book recently published by an author from Europe called False Alarm. This here speaks to the hedging of our new Supreme Court Justice Barrett when asked by now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris about climate change, so to deflect to that question. And here we see as recently that President Trump was making a push to oust the current head of the person responsible for looking at climate assessment. And so that gives you a take of the fact that this climate is very much alive. So I'm going to turn it over to Raul now to tell us a little bit about how we got together, how we came up with the idea, and how I came into it. So Raul?
Great. Let's see. I'm going to share the screen and...
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Slide. Oh,
remember
me
slide. The slide. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so the idea of the book really, in the beginning, the book didn't have to be about climate change. I was thinking, oh, this might be about, we could write about QAnon, you know, or some other group. But the main idea was, how is it that some of these fringe groups exist and maintain themselves and thrive? And so, my being an environmental educator, the topic of climate was the one that jumped at me. That, well, if you're going to write a book, might as well be climate. But climate is one of many issues we could have taken up, because the main question for the book isn't really about climate. The main question is, how can an alternative community maintain itself and kind of become strong over time, especially in this particular case, when that community actually is countering claims made by climate scientists on a topic that's a matter of science. I mean, this is their purview. And how did they do it? How are they able to do it and create a viable counter narrative? If you look at the literature, Oreskes and Conway, et cetera, have written about the lobbyists, the Koch brothers, all the money that goes into denying the climate change science. And this is all, great. This is where we start from. But Shondel and I focused on a different thing, which is, it's not just there's money going into this, the political entrepreneurs, but must be also something about the story itself that must be compelling, because it keeps people, it just takes them in and takes a hold of them. So it's the power of narrative. So I wanted to show a snippet of what we call narrative, which is just simply a story. Okay, how do I show? Bear with me one quick second. And just show a few, 2 minutes.
Need the sound.
No sound?
Sorry, Raul, when you shared your screen, I think you had to optimize it for sound. So
There's no sound. Okay.
So when you choose video, at the bottom of Zoom, you need to choose optimize for sound. There's a box to
or
tick.
use computer audio. It's a little box on the bottom left.
Okay. Wow.
So
Okay.
unshare and reshare.
Yeah. So something. Okay. This is. Okay.
You may have to leave share.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that. Well, it's okay. You don't need to. No need to view the video. It's just. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Now I lost Zoom.
Okay.
No, you are screen sharing.
Yeah.
Oh, it's there. Well,
let's close that.
I'll go back to the PowerPoint.
Okay.
It's fine. Well, it was just you can look it up on your own when you have time. It's just a quick snippet from a little bit more than 10 years ago of how the counter science narrative started. And it was just from telling a good story. So that snippet I was going to show is just, a narrator just giving the important elements of the skeptical narrative, but presenting it with kind of a dramatic tension, and which is what you really need to create a moving narrative. And so our answer is, it's the powers of narrative somehow that grabs people, puts them together, and maintains this thing, you know, against all odds, because they're countering the community of scientists mostly. So here is our theory. In this next slide, we say narrative and network are co-constitutive. Network is simply the network of people, policy actors that maintain the climate skeptical narrative, and the narrative being told by the network. And so we say it's like the chicken and the egg, who goes first? But you can't, because they are co-constitutive. The narrative shapes the network keeps the narrative alive. And so one of the claims that we make in the book is, if you want to understand the network of climate skeptics, their structure, their form, their organization comes from the narrative itself. And so we start out by saying, what are the properties of the narrative that we're looking at that make it so strong? And the properties are what we call the properties of an ideology. What makes a narrative such a strong, compelling one that you can call it an ideology? And on the left side, we have a couple of narrative properties that we look for in the text: autopoiesis, decontextualization, invariance, saturation. We'll go over these as we go along, some of them. And on the right side, there should be parallel properties of the network of people, that organization. And so autopoiesis is simply a fancy word for being self-contained, self-enclosed. So if you look at the text of the narrative, it's self-referential. It doesn't talk about things outside the story that it's telling. It doesn't recognize any other stories. But this has a parallel in the structure of the network, which is insular. It's exclusive. It's racist. It's what we call, it features homophily, where birds of a feather flock together. And so you see properties of the narrative mirror itself in the properties of the network. So another thing, this cartoon tries to make the point about how the narrative became so strong is, well, it's what the Jameson and Capella call the echo chamber, because part of this insulating effect of this network is that as you go along time, over time, more and more, you find the network listening only to itself. And so the voices you hear become less and less plurivocal over time, and more you're just listening. People are listening to each other within this self-contained group. So it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy. CO2 is harmless. CO2 is harmless. And so just echoing itself over and over again, more and more over time. Here's an example of what we mean by these narrative properties we're looking for when we're studying the text. And Shondel showed you pieces of the text we're studying. We're studying op-eds that we find online or in newspapers. So one property is called saturation. When a narrative becomes more and more ideological, we say we can find what you call saturation. And saturation is simply, you know, the narrative is talking about this particular issue, but it's universalizing the talk so that this particular issue stands in for every other issue. It becomes universal. It's not just talking about climate anymore, but the narrative bleeds over into everything else, because an ideology is a system constitutive narrative. It's an all-encompassing worldview. And so if you look at we got snippets of text from the same op-eds talking about climate, but you'll find the writer is talking about climate, and then all of a sudden, he or she breaks into something like here, in a world threatened by Islamism, by Ebola and other problems, the notion that thousands, et cetera, would have an effect on climate is appalling. And if you go to another op-ed piece about the global warming scandal and the clean power bill, all of a sudden the writer goes into this thread. Also at a grocery store I go to, Latina girl working at a cash register, works perfect English, bilingual American, started speaking fluent Spanish, etc. And it says, I bite my tongue. They're trying to change every aspect of American culture, changes to a multicultural, multilingual society. And so you see that this narrative of climate all of a sudden encompasses every other climate. It's a universal topic, a universal theme. So that's saturation. It saturates every other issue in the domain. Another example of a property that we look for in the text is decontextuality. The narrative is talking about what the narrative is talking about to the exclusion of everything else around it, including what's going on actually in the world around this text. A text exists right there somewhere in space or in the computer, etc. And if it ignores everything else in the context, current events, what other people are saying, science, this is decontextual. And so we try to spot elements of decontextualism in the narrative when we analyze the text. And here's an example of a snippet of it. Group of people I've not liked for decades are the environmentalists. Simple, they lie about everything they champion in the name of global warming or climate change. And so when you see statements getting more and more like sweeping universal statements, this is a sign of increasing decontextuality. And our claim is simply, if you go over time, and Shondel looked at 20 years of text, the last 20 years, if you study these properties in the op-ed pieces, these properties of the narrative, we find that they get more and more marked over time. They get more decontextual, more saturated, more invariant. And so they get more and more over time. And at some point, they approach, the narrative becomes what we call a full-fledged and closed ideology. So this is the claim of the book. If you look at it over time, it became more and more ideological. And Shondel, you'll tell us about that.
Yeah, I'll pick up from there. So you just take off and I'll share my screen again.
Okay.
Okay, I need you to move that off the screen so I can get my screen.
Oh, stop sharing. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, stop sharing. Stop sharing.
Yeah, stop sharing.
No, it's still sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay. So as we move into this question of the text, I just wanted to say briefly, when Raul approached me on the book, he wanted someone, we were actually out 2 years ago celebrating our promotion. This is literally how we got together. And he was telling me about this book project. And he said he wanted someone who could look more closely at the language of how this ideological evolved. And I said, oh, that sounds like something I can do. And literally, that's how this collaboration began. He had already started a draft of a proposal with Oxford, but then I came in during that process, and so we ended up putting the contract together, and the rest is history. So what happened in thinking about how I look at these texts, I said, if we're looking at narrative and we're looking at ideological narrative, we need a critical approach to language, critical approach to this narrative. And so, as you'll see in the following slides, I approach this through a critical discourse analysis. But first, how did we get to the beginning of this climate narrative? Back in the 90s, we had already what was called the green lash or brown lash anti-environmental movement. Some of the research by Ehrlich and Ehrlich talked about this, where already the term global warming was entering our discourse. And already these anti-science ideas started to appear in these op-eds and books and articles and through the media. And there was this kind of relentless repetition of ideas, of anti-science ideas, giving it this sort of aura of credibility. And it created confusion about the facts around science. And what came with that was a resistance to environmental policies. The anti-science movement, anti-climate change movement, then formed coalitions with other groups such as the Christian groups, Second Amendment rights, small government advocates. And so you could see how it reinforced Raul's discussion about this saturation. And of course, it had financial backing from the carbon extraction industries. So who is the climate skeptic community? So Lesarowitz and his colleagues at Yale did a study 2 years ago, a survey, and they found that 62% of the US do believe that climate change is mostly caused by humans, in the scientific term, anthropogenic climate change. But that means 38% of the US population do not believe climate change is caused mostly by humans. And the research also shows that most climate skeptics in the United States are conservative. And by the way, Raul also looked at the climate skeptic narrative in other areas in Europe and Asia as well. So what we did was I looked over 20 years of data, then we knocked it down to 80 pieces. These were all articles, op-eds, and then some online responses once the social media and the iPhone took off. And Environment and Climate is a publication, a newsletter of the Heartland Institute, which is a conservative think tank in the Midwest. And we looked at 50 articles from there. We looked at articles from the Washington Times, Breitbart, Daily Caller, all conservative media outlets. And in addition, the online responses to these articles. In selecting the text, I was looking specifically at how climate change, that the articles had to address something that had to do with global warming, carbon mitigation, or climate litigation. And it must have contained at least one sentence or in the headline that was skeptical towards climate science. So for example, the article called Global Warming Science Uncertain. So I mentioned that because this narrative has become so political, critical discourse seems the appropriate way to look at these texts. And so I can walk you through how this ideology happened over time. So what critical discourse is, and one of the leading voices on critical discourse is Norman Fairclough, which he defines as focused on critiquing the ways that discourse is internalized in power and vice versa. And discourses are always affected by the larger environment. How we communicate about things have a lot to do with who's speaking, who's the audience, what is going on in the larger sphere. An important part about critical discourse is that it tries to denaturalize the dominant ideology. So let's say the dominant way of thinking is climate change is in fact affected by human behavior, is induced by human behavior. And critical discourse attempts to normally take a look at what is and pull it apart. But in this case, what is the scientific consensus, and skeptics are saying, no, we're going to look at that in a different way. We're not going to accept that dominant way of thinking about science. So what I did was I mapped these properties that Raul talked about of narrative onto critical discourse, and looking at now what happens from a more critical perspective. So narratives have people, they have time, they have place, they have these properties, but how are these characters positioned? Who is speaking about the climate denial? Who are they speaking to? Who is the audience for this skepticism? What is their degree of power? Because we talked about critical discourse looking at power. Who is excluded from the dialogue? Who's included? And then what is the larger structure? who is the audience that Breitbart and Daily Caller and so on are talking to, and what's happening in the larger society, politically, technologically, and so forth. So what I offer you here is the 5 time periods that we looked at, starting from the beginning of this century up to the present, to give you the larger political and environment in which this narrative developed. So we have, in the first period, we have the first George Bush term, where at that point, he was simply asking for studies to question the science. He commissioned a number of studies to look at the actual scientific findings that were happening, skeptical about it, but yet looking at the science. When we get to the second Bush term, we have Hurricane Katrina. We have Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. We have the arrival of the iPhone in 2007. Hard to believe that it wasn't that long ago. It seems as though it's been with us forever. What that does is it gives an avenue for information to go viral. Then we enter the Obama era, where now you have a pro-climate administration, policies like cap and trade and so forth. Social media is exploding, technology is exploding. And then we have ClimateGate, which was the scandal of emails being hacked into in the UK, University of Anglia. In Obama's second term, the pro-climate policies continue, but at the same time, we have these hoax narratives starting to develop. And then the big achievement was the signing of the Paris Climate Accord. And then comes the Trump era, where all of that is upended. The climate, we withdraw from the Climate Accord, we reject the cap and trade, Obama's pro-climate policy, hoax narratives are amplified. At the same time, hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes are happening at record paces. So that's the big backdrop against which we're looking at the language of and the ideology of this narrative. So with me, I want you to, as we go through the language, work with me and look at what I have highlighted. In yellow is sort of the general skeptic narrative all along. In green are the micro level, what critical discourse analysis has a micro level analysis, a meso level looking at who's the audience, and then that macro level of what's going on in the environment, as I mentioned. So in the first period, we're still in the stage where we're questioning the science. So we have an article titled IPCC Report Criticized by one of its lead authors. This is from the Environment and Climate book. The IPCC, by the way, is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. That is the leading panel at the United Nations that does scientific research on the climate. And
no,
in yellow,
chat that we can't see your screen right now.
You can't see my screen?
No, and it sounds.
Oh, sorry. All of this time you couldn't see my screen?
That's correct.
Oh my goodness. I am so sorry.
But you were presenting it very well, Shondel.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, okay. Where's the share screen here? I'm looking for the share. Here it is. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to show you that time period. That's what the timeline looks like. So you see it. And so here you have the words, one of the leading atmospheric physicists, Richard Anzin. What that does, it says that Lindzen writes this article, makes a claim, politics is driving the work on climate change. Lindzen was one of the authors of that very report by the IPCC. And so by giving him authority and saying he's the leading atmospheric physicist, what we do then is start a narrative where the skeptic begins to get authority by giving his title. But if we look later, we see here, he claimed to use these strategies, that the report was misleading, alarming the public. All of the words highlighted in green starts to begin a narrative of questioning the science. They use summaries of scientific studies rather than actual documents to misrepresent the work of scientists, giving a false impression, exaggerating scientific accuracy, preying on the public's ignorance of science. So here is the first period in the George Bush administration where these studies that the administration asked were being questioned by some of the what were called contrarian scientists on the panel. Then when we get to the second period, we start to now, we're in the period that I mentioned where Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth is now out, which is the major film taking on climate science and as led by Al Gore. Climate activists used the release of the documentary film to reinforce their claim that human-induced global warming is an emergency unless we change our lifestyle. So that phrase now introduced the idea that a claim is being made, but it's also asking us to change our lifestyle at the same time. And so the pushback now begins. Again, we see the word false and alarmist here. And then we begin to characterize the climate advocates as non-scientists. He and other, he meaning Al Gore, and other climate advocates who are non-scientists are ignoring, and here we have a play, inconvenient facts. We'll talk about facts later on, now that we're in the era of alternative facts. So inconvenient truth is now turned on its head, and the counter narrative is now saying they're ignoring inconvenient facts, which is that they're not scientists, and the climate has always been changing. You recall at the beginning that cartoon where they said the climate has always been changing. So look at how a simple turn of phrase changes the narrative. When climate scientists say the climate is changing, it seems innocuous enough. But when we say the climate has always been changing, now we're saying that there's nothing specifically that humans have anything to do with. This is the normal course of the weather patterns. And so by simply introducing has always been, it removes responsibility from human intervention. And so now what I have in blue here is new ideas, new themes emerging into the narrative, saying climate is changing by both humans and natural availability. So that seems a bit of a contradiction, because what that's doing is infusing doubt into the human element, but also saying this is just a natural variability of what is happening. And now we introduce a critique of the climate advocates by saying it's essentially a moral crusade achieved through persistent repetition of claims not supported by science. So in fact, now we've moved from the studies in period one, which was just looking at the science, to now getting into the moral tenor of the people who are advocating climate change. So what happens with a narrative here is these invariant claims recurring, and then new themes are coming on. So we see this period one, this politicization of science, the claim that is misrepresented. And by the way, the summaries of these articles was written from the point of view of the skeptic, because I had to get in the head of the skeptic to see that position before it could then be critiqued. Secondly, we see in the second period, some articles which were not here shared talked about climate scientists, skeptics being punished when they speak out. There's still uncertainty. These activists are exploiting science for financial gain, and they are putting regulations which will affect the economy. So in addition to those articles, other articles start to bring in questions of morality, questions of the economic impact, and so forth. When we move to the third period, this is an article from the Washington Times, global warming winners. And winners here now, we see sarcasm being introduced as a strategy. Climate change activism has become a profitable industry, one of the greatest frauds and scandals of our time. So here we start to get what Raul talked about, this absolutist language, greatest fraud. Whenever we use superlative forms, greatest, biggest, we know that our current president loves to talk about, I did the most for the African-American community. Anytime we start to get language in absolute forms, it starts to become this inner sort of language speaking to itself, because it doesn't allow for any other point of view coming in. So Al Gore has been the biggest financial winner. So the movie that was meant to educate the public about the climate and Inconvenient Truth is now being shifted to Al Gore. And as Al Gore using this simply to amass a fortune, all that's in blue here, profit from increased government regulations and sweetheart deals from connected politicians, and giving a free pass. So now the media is also charged with continuing this climate science at the expense of the skeptics. So the media is charged with giving a free pass by spreading his propaganda. So in this piece, we see exploiting it for financial gain, the media being complicit, and here we see the word alarm again coming up. I looked at the online media responses when I mentioned that the iPhone was something that helped to spread information and perpetuate what Raul calls these echo chambers. And here we have examples of how you keep that narrative becoming more ideological. We call the public Al Gore's fault. It is the uneducated and incapable of critical thinking masses who have gone through our public school system that are responsible for the hoax. Here we see the word hoax. A second strategy is attributing sinister motives using scare quotes. It's difficult not to be cynical when these protectors of the world are just political operatives. They have zero moral authority. So here again, we see this moral narrative and repetition. Now it's interesting that it was accusing the climate supporters of repeating their narrative, their hoax, but yet here we have a repetition of the word fraud, repetition of the word scam, hoax, alarmist, just in this time period alone, not to mention the whole corpus of the text. Just in this time period, these words kept coming up. And part of what makes the narrative ideological is if you repeat something enough, you make it true. Certainly true to the listener who's already predisposed to that narrative, that insular community that Raul talked about. So in this period, what's happening? These ideological traits begin to take hold. Those themes from periods 1 and 2 begin to harden. We see them more and more. Politicization of science. The science is unsettled. The policymakers are using information now for financial gain. I want to mention a little bit about what Michael Mann, who's a prominent climate scientist, calls the Serengeti strategy. The Serengeti strategy is named after the Serengeti plain in Africa, in East Africa, where the animals, the predators, would pick off one prey to make an example of. And so Michael Mann argues that Al Gore was subject to the Serengeti strategy. He became the face of climate change, the one person you could hold up and attack and get an audience to rally around. And it's no longer just Al Gore the person, but Al Gore the idea of this elite person making money from talking about climate change. And then you keep the group rallied around that, being against that idea. Very much like we had the Willie Horton ads with George H.W. Bush, or we have AOC, for example, being the face of the progressive left. So that's the Serengeti strategy, making one person, picking off what they might see as a prey and using that person to rally around an idea. When we get to the fourth period, the hoax and fiction narrative now starts to get amplified. So we see skeptical science is debunked, because that's the period now where we're in the Obama era. And the climate assessment report, which just comes out every 2 years, is now called a work of fiction, essentially a marketing tool to scare citizens into action. And look at who it was debunked by: a group of prominent scientists. So again, the climate skeptics now elevate their scientists as prominent and making the science report of the administration a work of fiction. Here's an example of what Raul talks about: saturation. This is in response to this very article here. And we see nothing has ever evolved. The false doctrine of evolution is what is driving the false narrative of global warming. So we've jumped to evolution, again, because the same set of principles apply, where you have these sweeping claims and you have a set of characters being framed in a particular way. And here we see again the hoax that costs us $4 billion a day. So by simply claiming that the climate science is a hoax and repeating that, and then we introduce this idea that it's designed to take away our freedom and benefit dishonest activists. And then finally, in the period which we are now, hopefully soon coming to an end, the Trump era, now we have a complete change in administration, and we see it says drastically different in Obama administration. President-elect Trump vows to cancel US participation in the Paris Climate Accord, which he did. And so we see the drastically different language here. And this alliterative use of to make the contrast between Trump and Obama, it'd be a welcome change from the power grabbing, energy strangling, economy crushing legacy of Obama's. So that alliterative stress on power, energy, economy really begins to solidify that claim to separate the Obama era from the Trump era. So underlying a lot of this narrative is an us and them frame in terms of how you keep the ideology going. And then a kind of almost denial. The battle is over. This is in response to Trump's first State of the Union speech. Climate change is a non-issue. No one is talking about it. Now, Trump did not speak about it in the event, but you say no one is talking about it anymore. So you apply that to everyone and you occupy the discourse spaces as that is sort of self-evident. And so the skeptic narrative therefore prevails. So what you have here is the hardening of all of those themes, change being taken away, activists as dishonest people, and then finally change has come. Change in the Trump era, where you have the person in the highest office of the land being a climate skeptic, climate denier. So the narrative has evolved now back to my timeline from misrepresenting science to arguing beyond science to this global crusade, this moral battles. Through the Obama era with pro-climate policies, now it moves to the sinister, the character of the climate here, and then finally the era of alternative facts, where it's no even longer relevant. We are just going to pretend that there's not a problem with climate. So I'm going to hand it back to Raul, and you can take it from there.
Thanks, Shondel.
Just remember to share your screen this time.
Is
Yes.
it being shared?
Yes, it says your battery's running low too.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. So Shondel talked about really the first half of the book. And I just wanted to very briefly go over some of the other things the book tries to do. And so if we jump to chapter 5 is talking about how come it's so easy when we're reading an op-ed about climate for the same op-ed to jump into another issue like immigration, Second Amendment rights, etc. And it's like these issues come together so easily. And so the insight of this chapter is maybe they're based on some genetic meta-narrative, a more abstract narrative that is telling the same story in climate that's being told with the gun rights, with the anti-immigration narrative, etc. And we wanted to show this. And so one of the approach we took was taken from formalist narratologist, a Russian narratologist, who wrote this book, The Morphology of the Folktale. And what Prop did was he looked at hundreds of Russian folk tales, fairy tales, etc., and tried to boil it down into showing that, you know, these hundreds of stories can all be summarized into, you know, a number of basic plot lines. The same basic set of stories are told over and over again. And instead of the hundreds or thousands of stories, you can find this just smaller set of basic plots that it all boils down to. And so we took this and tried to look for commonalities in the plot across different issue areas: climate, gun rights, immigration. And this is how we did it. We just used some way of portraying the structure of the narrative, of the plot. In this case, we used the model from Greimas, structural linguist. We just had this very simple actantial model where you have a subject trying to attain an object. And so you can always summarize a plot that way. There's some subject trying to attain an object, and there is an opposition, and there is a helper. And so we use this to characterize, on the left side, how do we characterize, fit the climate skeptical narrative to this very simple structure. And we did that for the other issue areas. So I'm showing on the right side, we did it for the anti-immigration narrative. So for example, if you look at the anti-immigration narrative, the subject trying to attain the object, which is the majority trying to attain on top the American dream. And there are groups assisting and groups impeding. The opponents happen to be, in this case, minorities, through inserting alien elements into society, Spanish language, different elements of culture, are impeding the majority from attaining the American dream. Well, this plot is kind of the same for the climate one, where you have the group trying to attain the American dream, but the impeding factor here are all the carbon regulations, the critique of consumer society. And so we see commonalities in plot. One commonality is there is always an other preventing the subject from attaining its goal. Whether the other is the eco-extremist or the immigrant, the other with its alien influence prevents the subject from attaining the object. And so we were just trying to show and point out these issue narratives all are based on the same common basic plot. And that's why it's so easy for them to come together and be told by very different groups of people who come together under the same umbrella of climate denial. What is that meta-narrative that is common to all the issue areas? So we tried to boil it down to a kind of a basic Brody's note plot. And it's something like the snippet we show here. You know, we have this dream we're trying to attain, but others are telling us, you're now wrong. Your old ways are wrong. And in fact, you are wrong. And the alien is coming into our world and opposing us and telling us that everything we're used to is now alien. And this basic plot runs through climate denial. It runs through anti-immigration narratives. It runs through gun rights narratives. And so this gives us insight, going back to climate again. Why is climate denial so hard to kind of contend with? Because there's more science every day we go by, more science, more consensus among the scientists. Well, the first insight we get, if you look at the meta-narrative, the narrative was never about the science to begin with. It was about social fracture, about a group of people being told, you're not in the right anymore. There's a new day coming and you're not part of it. And this common narrative makes it easier for different groups to.
Okay. Raul, you have to plug in. Raul, your battery.
I'm guessing that we know what caused that.
Okay. Well, he's going to have to move his screen, so I can pick out.
I think if someone has hosting capabilities, they
Yes.
can remove his screen.
Okay.
I was just gonna
Shondel.
go,
Yeah,
how
Jackie,
do I
can you
do
move
that?
Yes.
Because I don't
Okay.
think he
Oh,
might,
there it
he might be on
goes.
Yep,
Oh.
there we go.
There it goes.
Okay. So then I'm going to share my screen. Let me share my screen.
Thank you for your quick adaptability. There he is. He's back on.
He's back. Raul. Okay, Raul, are you there? Well, okay. I think we'll have to move on. Sorry about that. I think so. I think we got the, can you all see my screen? Yes? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Raul is back on though, and he now has his headset on. So
Okay, Raul, sorry.
I am so sorry, my computer conked out, but you take over, Shondel.
Raul, no, I can share your screen. You can go ahead and finish.
Okay, so and then very quickly, the last thing I wanted to mention was chapter 6, going to a different chapter now. Chapter 6, the main point there was Shondel had looked at the elements of ideology and the narrative of the climate skeptics. We now use the same analysis to look at speech from climate advocates and climate scientists. And we found troubling the same ideological elements of narrative. For example, I just show a snippet here about how they talked about a climate contrarian. Judith Curry embarrassed all women by joining, etc. Judy Curry's brain goes on hiatus. And it's just this ideological talk starting to pop up on the other side, on the side of climate scientists and advocates. It's like ideology begets ideology. So I'm going to skip the next 2 slides and bring it back to Shondel.
Okay. So in just as we get towards the end, so a larger backdrop of these narratives goes back to what was called the reflexive modernization movement after World War II, when the world was being called upon to look at all of the great technological developments we made, but how it was costing or doing harm to the environment. And that gave rise to what was called impact science. But the call to do a critical self-reflection on what we were doing to the environment was anathema to conservatives, because conservatives are staunch defenders of the industrial capital order and personal freedoms. And we saw in the narratives how they're saying, this is in fact affecting my personal freedom. Now you're telling me what kind of car I should drive. And so that history goes before the 1990s. There was resistance to vaccine, to the anti-smoking, regulations on the oil and pharmaceutical industry, and that social fracturing that Raul talks about. So all of that was happening already, and now we're in this, what I'm calling the post-truth world. So where do we go from here? Let me say that some of the proposals we're saying for breaking this impasse are modest, because we are talking about a larger social fracturing that will go way beyond just dealing with climate. But because language is at the core of discourse, one thing we can do is begin to change the language. Now there's a political magazine from last year, which was entitled A New Language of Climate Change. And this was already happening, where scientists were going out into communities in the Midwest and making the talk about climate more relatable to, say, farmers who might have been resistant. And this is a quote from the article: "Stop talking about who or what is most responsible and focus instead on what is happening, how unusual it is, and what it's costing communities. It's a job story, an agriculture story. Connect it to Farm Bill and boom, it starts to build trust." Now that might seem like a simple thing. However, the idea of breaking an impasse requires some trust. And until trust is established, it's hard to break ideological boundaries. And then we are suggesting resisting absolutist language. We could have called this book Climate Denial instead of, where we chose Climate Skepticism. Now, scientists, skepticism is a normal, healthy practice in science. However, among the ones that are resisting, it's been used as a sort of a shield for what is in fact denial. However, we were resisting the use of the word denial because denial becomes very absolute. Skepticism, at the very least, allows for dialogue. And that's what scientists do. And so absolutist language, like using all of those superlatives, like I said, increases ideological thinking. We're suggesting changing the messenger. Often a message can get lost by the wrong messenger. The loudest voices are not necessarily the most effective voices. So entrusting leaders from the community to talk about science at the local level, town halls, speakers of diverse backgrounds, which begins to work against that echo chamber impulse. The communication strategies in the mainstream and social media are probably the hardest because we are in this so-called post-truth world. And it's funny because in a way, postmodernism, which sort of goes against any sort of absolute truth, has been turned on its head. And now anything gets said, and truth and facts now are completely blurred. And when Kellyanne Conway used that term, alternative facts, she was actually onto something, meaning that idea is very much alive out there. And so to get facts through to people in a post-truth alternative facts world really requires work on both sides. So I think we have to develop new paradigms and strategies for truth telling in the mainstream and on social media. And that requires then the other work in the larger social society of ways of people talking across lines, using language that might begin to open up space that is less absolute, less insular. And then we have to set more inclusive rules of engagement on social media, because social media is ripe for being an echo chamber because you can just talk to other people that just think like you. Raul has done ethnographic work on climate change. We think more of that work. There have been experimental studies already done. One uses what's called inoculation theory, where when you present a story, you sort of, it's like the way you inoculate with a vaccine. You present, you get the sort of mistruths out of the way first, and you try to balance the message in introducing the story, so that they've shown that when information is presented where the sort of counter narrative is taken on first and dealt with, you're more likely to get an open reception to other points of views when it's engaged and head on. The frame narratives have looked at, if you frame the climate in other ways, saying this is a way to good stewardship of the environment rather than this is due to human behavior, the reception has been shown in these experimental studies to have a better reception when you frame the narrative in a different way to people thinking in a more positive frame of being good stewards of the environment. And if researchers did ethnographic work, doing the work in the communities, looking at how people story the environment and getting those stories ground up and engaging those stories in a way that relates to people's lives more directly rather than sort of abstract pronunciations about climate, some of the work by Phillips and Dickey have shown that that begins to move the needle somewhat. And finally, teaching climate change. Misconception-based learning is already happening in schools. The American Educator dedicated their entire issue last December to climate, where misconceptions about science are taken on in the classroom and dealt with, and in a more inclusive discourse around science, questioning what is exactly beyond the skepticism and getting to those deeper issues that Raul talked about of social fracturing, which reveals itself in climate skeptic discourse, so that the classroom becomes a place for addressing these issues early on in K-12, so that we have a new generation of people who are more climate engaged. I want to end with a quote from our new president-elect, Joe Biden, which he, in his victory speech last Saturday night, he said, "Americans have called on us to marshal the forces of science and forces of hope in the great battles of our time." And he listed a number of battles. And the last was the battle to save the climate. I'm going to stop there. Raul, did you have any final thoughts or comments?
Oh, nothing, just to thank our colleagues at Oxford Press and for their support, Sarah and Emma, and of course thank Kath for always being supporting us, especially the client, the science education aspects of it. If we had enough time, we should talk about it, but for some other time maybe.
Right. And your research assistants you see there, and also the cartoonists who drew some of those wonderful cartoons for us. And of course, thank you, the audience, for coming out and sharing with us on our thoughts on climate. Thank you very much. And I think we're open for questions. I'm going to
We're
stop
actually at time.
Oh, wow.
But we could, I think if people wanted to, if I can take over the hosting, if people want to stay and ask some questions, I'm happy to stay around. So can we do that, Jackie? Can you make me host?
Sure can.
Sure.
Thank you. So I think if there's anyone here who'd like to ask Raul and Shondel some questions, or maybe even raise issues, if everybody, anyone who needs to leave or wants to leave, thank you so much for joining us. I think I really appreciate the work that Shondel and Raul are doing, and they've really raised some great questions. I think Anna and Bob, who are at the presentation, we're going to use your book in our new course. So thank you so much for that. And so if you need to go, just thank you. And Shondel and Raul, if you're happy to stay for a few minutes, we can take some questions if anyone has some questions.
Sure.
How does that work for people?
Sure.
Okay.
Apologies for going over time with some of the glitches with the
what happens at Zoom.
Okay. So Jackie's off or no?
No, I'm here. So
Yes.
Scott has a question.
Sure.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Scott.
Great presentation and framework for understanding this issue. So I just wanted to give that compliment before my question.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there's any advice or empirical evidence of what works, or examples, evidence of examples that work on how to describe the costs to reach those non-echo chamber audiences. Is it lives lost, or money from damage, or some other factor that might be most effective?
Raul, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Well, you'd mentioned this idea of inoculation, which is, so maybe a little bit of that, Shondel. What is inoculation?
Well, inoculation, these were experimental studies done where they've shown that when you take on the sort of myth first in presenting information and talking about climate, if the belief of the other side is taken on first, rather than approaching it from this is what it's costing, this is what it's doing, which automatically puts the other side in defensive. So what you do is you kind of put out, it's a way of messaging. You take on the opposing side first and talk through, hear through why is it that perception is there. Show why that perception does not actually address the climate itself, but often, as Raul said, it's something below the surface that has nothing to do with the actual climate, that you sort of diffuse some of the resistance to the other narrative. Because what's found was the resistance is not even that your idea was debunked, is that the other side is saying it. The resistance becomes simply the resistance to the other. So by engaging the other side first, it opens up, they've shown that it opens up a space to inoculate against mostly the resistance to hearing what is perceived as being preached at by the other side. So often is taking the other point of view first as the starting point, rather than sort of preaching it with numbers, because data has not proven to convince anyone. Scientists have given lots and lots and lots of data. So it's actually not about the data. It's about the messaging of whose point of view gets foregrounded first, if that makes any sense.
It does. So I could talk about natural cycles and their effect on climate as a starting point, because that's part of the basis of belief of what's going on.
Precisely. And then move from there.
Cooling, but here's what's actually happening.
Right. So that's what inoculation is. It's taking on the skeptic point of view first, because as Raul said, the tendency is to throw more data at the problem, and that actually doesn't get anywhere.
Well,
So,
I'm reading the
Shondel,
comments, and Joanna
oh, sorry.
has a comment. And Marcia has a, I'm just.
I think Erica has a question.
Oh.
Erica, do you, and then Marsha.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. This is totally not my area of expertise as a researcher, but as a person, I've been very interested in these narratives. My question is, how, or do the methodologies that you employed allow for you to track the calcification of these narratives of climate change with the calcification of the narratives around everything else? So, for example, I don't think it's an accident that these harder line, more absolutist narratives happened under the Obama administration, because he was a Black president. And so, but do these methodologies, and it may have been beyond the scope of the book and the presentation, but do these methodologies allow for that, for the tracking of these narratives at their intersections in the way that helps inform these meta narratives that you talked about in the book?
We haven't done that, but as Raul, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, Shondel did the tracking over 20 years looking at climate op-eds. Now, we didn't do it, but we could have done this tracking you're talking about over 20 years over all the other issue areas too, and just show that how everything, as you said, calcified, turned into a hard and rigid narrative, ideology, and that you get into these conspiracy fringe groups being more and more emboldened. We could have done that. So it's possible to do that with this method.
Absolutely. I mean, Raul showed that it's really like a formula, that template with these, you have a helper, you have a narrative, you have an other. And Barack Obama and his policies became a perfect other, and because a counter narrative requires an other against which the narrative is put up against. And so Barack Obama became, and his policies, his climate-friendly policies, as you saw, the language of hoax and fiction became, because remember in the Bush era, it was just questioned in the science and the studies. And over time, we see those words creeping up more during the Obama era. So it was both, that's why I talked about the larger sociopolitical environment, which created a perfect space for this other. So yes, we didn't do it, but I'm sure that it could certainly be tracked to views on under other issues as well.
Thank you, Shondel. Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Erica. Marsha.
Yeah, this actually flows right into the comment I was going to make. First of all, thank you very much. I thought your book was really terrific in going through it, and it dovetails with a lot of the work that I've done on populism and the recent rise in populism and the language used in populism. So I was particularly pleased and impressed by your zooming out and looking at the larger template. It's what I found as well, that under duress, which can be economic, but can also be perceived threats to way of life, spurred by changes in demographics, gender role, technology, etc. Under duress, people need a framework to feel effective, to understand what's going on, and to feel that they can do something. And the most easily available frameworks are often us-them frameworks that are pre-existing in the culture. Right. One of the very, very deep us-them frameworks in our culture is suspicion of elites, central government, intellectualism, which has very democratic roots, but under duress can torque into an us-them framework. And that's, I think, why you found that template overlaps into the gun issue, the environment issue, the immigration issue, and now mask wearing.
That's
mask
right.
Wearing, right? Right?
That's right. That's right. Right. And by the way, this book we were going to press this year just as the lockdown and COVID happened. And we say in the preface, this book, you could have just removed the word climate and just injected COVID, and we would have another book.
Yeah.
All the issues are exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's the meta narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you, Marcia.
it's very much part of a duress prodded populist response. The duress is real and really felt. But it's a question of what solutions people choose, and ready to hand us them paradigms and are easily graspable. And in this country, the anti-intellectual suspicion of government, suspicion of science is as old as the colonial era. So you could write a whole series of books, right, from environmentalism to immigration to mask wearing, etc.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Marcia. Now Frank,
Exactly.
and then Konji.
So actually just piggybacking a bit about what Marcia's saying, and I'm wondering, so one of the things with my experience in living mainly in the United States and in Europe, one thing that I've always seen as quite a discerning factor is the concept of faith in the United States versus the concept of faith in Europe, and how in Europe, I've always had a sense that there is a true separation or a tension to a separation between church and state. So there's a church, whatever the church is, and a state. In the United States, there actually is not. And part, as Marcia says, going way back, there is an actual embeddedness in the fabric of the country around faith. And clearly since Reagan, we've seen a rise, right, in starting from faith and this need to acknowledge faith, and how that has sort of also superimposed itself on many narratives, but particularly one around climate change, right? To what extent is any question around a climate also a question of the validity of a faith, which is all-knowing around the environment? And so I'm wondering if that came up in any way in terms of narratives or sources.
I would say that, the faith science argument goes back. I mean, the whole evolution thing, right? Notice that one of the online things meant jump to evolution. So one of the frames used to talk about climate to evangelicals is that, to say, which has worked, to say, rather than, you need to not drive cars that are spewing too much CO, but, God gave us this planet to take care of. And that becomes an opening. So a way to sort of soften faith versus science rather as adversarial, to, again, start from their position and say, because the bottom line is we need to get a handle on this climate. So if faith is an entry point to an evangelical, then let's try that. So that's one of the approaches to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's a unique thing that makes it all the more challenging, as you point out. It goes back to your inoculation approach, that
right.
It is a factor in this country which is very different from
Europe.
From Europe. And so where climate science has not had to battle faith in the public arena, I'm not saying it doesn't battle faith. So even the official churches in Europe have their own position on climate science, which tends to be more favorable towards the importance of it,
right.
despite faith. So,
yeah, thanks, Frank.
Okay, Konji, go.
Raul and Shondel, this is great presentation, and congrats for the publication for the book.
Thank
you. So
I
have a question in relation to the analytical framework. Shondel, we haven't talked about this before. I was wondering, have you ever thought about how or whether this critical narrative analysis can help us understand other issues in relation to how racial ideology being articulated or being formed in the United States? So that's one question. And another one is that if we think about in the study of critical theory, there also a kind of research methodology tell the narratives from the minoritized people. I'm wondering that if you think about this, how this critical narrative analysis could empower minoritized researcher and community to tell a different story. This may be just.
Sure. At the time I was showing the Venn diagram with the overlap, my share screen wasn't working, but you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint. Yes, because I think that a critical approach to many minoritized issues or many narratives around race could benefit from this overlap, because these narratives are out there. But I think the critical approach, whether it's in questions of indigenous language rights or, let's say migration. I mean, we can think of any number of what it does is that I think it allows us to look more at what is underlying the narrative, who has the power to drive the narrative, and who is excluded or included from the narrative, so that we're holding up a screen to the narrative itself. And I think the critical level allows us to do that in a way that I think it can make richer cases for critical race theory is already taking a critical approach. But I think narrative analysis itself, like Raul said, he started out the book with focusing on a narrative, and then we got together. I brought in the critical discourse approach and sort of that a kind of overlay. And I think it definitely could work for other issues in the social sciences, or even in our field in applied linguistics, in a way that looking at frames and so on more critically.
Kath, we should hear from Joanna all the way from the University of California. Maybe you just ask your first question, Joanna.
Hi, everyone. I think I should first introduce myself because I am a longtime mentee of Raul's. I'm a climate scientist now at UCI, where he used to teach in a social ecology program. And many years ago, I came to him with a little idea, and we and he taught me so much from that one little meeting we had on, really good. And I have the book here. I read it. It's all bookmarked. As an environmental scientist and educator, I really appreciate this kind of effort to help us in a science world to communicate with the world outside of science, which is something that needs to be said. These are two different worlds and they function differently. We process information differently, we communicate differently. And so we've been operating in this assumption that scientists can just share what we talk internally in the same format with the same language, using the same narrative elements, that you can just go and show all that to the general public. That's what the scientists normally think, right? And to the point that, it gets to a point that scientists will say that that they feel like they need to dumb it down, which is completely absurd. When you're communicating with the general public, you don't have to dumb it down. You have to emotion it up. So this is the work we've been doing here from the inside of the ivory tower, is trying to educate other scientists about letting go of the deficit of information model and learning to speak as humans again, because we go through all this training, and after 8 years you finish your PhD and you don't talk like a human anymore when you talk about science. You talk like a Vulcan. So you need to, adding those human elements of emotion, bringing art, bringing elements that resonate with people on an emotional level. I agree with Shondel and Raul that we've given people enough information and data and numbers and costs. And while this is important and necessary to validate the strength of our arguments, it's not sufficient if it comes without this richness of the narrative, right? The richness of the narrative. So thank you so much for bringing this up. I have questions, I have requests. I don't know if you have time for this. My first question is related to, now here we are, we have this crisis in our hands. As a scientist and an educator, how can I and my peers here move forward without, is it necessary for us to let go of the climate change language and narrative that we've been using thus far? So in your book, you have this amazing ending in which you give us very specific recommendations. I really enjoyed the part in which you talk about finding the right spokesperson, the right messenger, right? We obviously need to be sending those messengers inland to the rural parts of this country. We still had 70 million voters who did not think that climate change was a strong enough argument to vote the still incumbent president out of office. And so we need to have these people that can come into those communities. I love when you say, you know, create panels and have those town hall meetings with people who are local, and then bring the expert from the outside, or have some kind of collaboration with the local experts and give them a voice. I like that. But can we still talk about even climate change? Should we just stop talking about climate change? Should we start talking about environmental health? You know, should we start just identifying all those things that have already been corrupted beyond, you know, that will shut people off immediately?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Life. Yeah. I mean, in the example, when that article says, make it relatable to people's lives, right? So Raul has done work with the Rohingya refugees, right? So maybe Raul, you can mention that. But I think that it takes both sides, right, to come together to start to talk, because we can't just be, you know, throwing out study after study after study. But I think the entry point might be broader discussions about life and changes that normal people notice in their lives, and starting from there. Just as a story, we relate to people through story. Narratives are part of how we connect to the world. So I think maybe starting from that relatable place might be a good starting point. And it doesn't have to be dumbed down. People actually are respected when they feel related to and something that you can recognize. So I think that was sort of the idea. Raul, did you have?
Well, if I can add something real quick to what Joanna was saying and what Frank was saying, you know, we all need ideology to make sense of the world. What happens though, that's the problem, is some ideologies harden and become closed off, autopoietic. Right. And the problem here is the scientific community, the way it talks back to the skeptical community. I'm not talking about Trump, I'm talking about people in the everyday, people next to us. It is an alienating discourse coming from the climate scientists now. And so what's happening is the closing off to actual conversations. And one of the things we have to do is respect people and know where they're coming from. You know, we don't need to talk about science. That's not the main crux of the issue. It's about people losing control over lives and their communities. And so we got to talk about, you know, we can act on climate. It doesn't have to lay waste to your lifestyle and community. You tell me what you want to do about it, instead of the scientists telling you, oh, you just got to reorganize everything, throw away your car and everything. And so speak to people's fear of losing their lifestyles, their identities.
I see that Conji's hand is still up. Conji, are you still there? Did you have a follow-up?
No, I think Brian. I think Brian is the next person. And maybe Brent. Brian will be Brian, and who else?
Brent.
Okay.
Oh, it's Brent. Is that Brent? Brent is my friend.
Sorry. Oh,
Brent is my friend.
My mistake.
Hey, Brent.
That's okay, Catherine with a K. You're forgiven.
Hey, Brent.
Hi. So, you know, I had to ask you this question, right, Shondel? You guys clearly need to collaborate on another book, a follow-up to this, with, you know, using, you know, the things you've discovered, you know, quite, you know, presciently, to sort of framework, you know, a solution, you know, for the average politician, local to national, to use as a playbook.
Uh-huh.
Right? Because it's clearly, you know, there's a lot of ground here that can be covered, right? And you guys have got the, you know, you've done all the hard work, you know, you've been to the dance, you've seen it, so take it to the next step. Huh, no fun.
Thank you, Raul. Brent is my longtime high school friend, for those of you who don't know. So,
thanks, Brent.
And he's actually back home in Guyana right now. So,
one of 3 people in Guyana, right?
Thanks. So, Raul, there's our charge. We got charged for writing a follow-up book.
Yeah, okay. I'll send the letter to the press tomorrow.
Thanks for coming in.
Well, I think, thank you, Bryn. Apologies for my mispronunciation of your name, but I think it's a good place maybe to finish. I want to thank, since I know for Raul, it's like 1:30 in the morning or something, isn't it, Raul, where you're coming to us from?
Don't worry.
Yeah, Raul is in Hong Kong right now. Yeah.
So, and if you've stayed the distance, you're either completely absorbed by the ideas that Raul and Shondel are exploring, or your friend or family, I'm not sure, or both. So I just want to say a really absolutely a great thanks to both of you again. And, you know, maybe we should continue this conversation because I think you've raised some great questions about, and as I said to you, I'd love to do, and this is just an invitation. So I'm an editor-in-chief of a journal called Cultural Studies of Science Education. So if anyone would like to volunteer to do a book review of Shondel and Raul's book for the journal, I'd love to receive it. And maybe that would also provide another pathway for opening up further conversation about what you say in your book. So it's out there. I don't know if there's anyone who might be interested, but if you are, just get in touch with me. I'd love to have a review of the book in our journal. And I just want to thank you both. So maybe we can all join together in thanking Raul and Shondel for their presentation. And
thank you, everyone.
And you know, they're both on sabbatical too. So I mean, even more impressive that they came out and did this presentation. So thank you both.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out. And feel free to text or follow up with me after. Thanks, Kath. Great time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks.